The howling wind slammed against the stagecoach with a force that shook Eleanor Hayes to her core, each violent gust threatening to tear the vehicle from the treacherous mountain pass that connected Denver to the mining settlement of Silver Creek. It was December of 1878, and what had begun as light snow flurries had transformed into one of the most vicious blizzards Colorado had seen in decades. Eleanor clutched her traveling bag tighter against her chest, her knuckles white beneath her leather gloves. The other passengers, a silver-haired banker, a young married couple, and a traveling salesman, had fallen silent as the situation grew increasingly dire. The driver's shouts barely penetrated the roar of the storm, and the horse's panicked neighs sent chills down Eleanor's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "We ought to turn back," the banker muttered, his face ashen as he peered through the frost-covered window. "No schedule's worth dying for." But before anyone could respond, the stagecoach lurched violently. Eleanor heard the driver cry out a sound that ended abruptly. The world tilted, then spun. Her body slammed against the side of the coach, then the ceiling became the floor as the vehicle tumbled from the narrow road, rolling once, twice, before coming to rest upside down in a deep ravine. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor blinked in the darkness, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip. Her head throbbed, but she could move her limbs. "Is everyone all right?" she called out, her voice trembling. Groans answered her. The young wife was sobbing quietly, cradled in her husband's arms. The banker wasn't moving. The salesman clutched his arm, his face contorted in pain. "The door's blocked," the husband said after attempting to push it open. "There's snow, so much snow." Eleanor felt the first flutter of genuine panic. The stagecoach had become their coffin, buried beneath the relentless Colorado blizzard. "We're going to freeze to death," the salesman whispered, voicing what they all feared. Hours passed in a haze of increasing cold and diminishing hope. The banker had been pronounced dead, his body now covered with Eleanor's spare shawl. The married couple huddled together, whispering prayers. The salesman had fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing shallow. Eleanor pressed her face against a small crack in the window, desperate for any sign of rescue, though she knew it was futile. No one would brave this storm, and by morning they would likely all be frozen. That's when she heard it, a sound different from the wind, scraping, persistent, determined. "Hello?" she called, her voice weak. "Is someone there?" The scraping grew louder. Snow shifted around them, and suddenly, a sliver of gray light penetrated the darkness. "Hold on in there," a deep voice called through the growing opening. "I'm digging you out." Hope surged through Eleanor's veins like fire. She turned to the others. "Someone's found us." The digging continued for what seemed like eternity. Eleanor could hear the man's labored breathing, his occasional curses as he fought against the elements. Finally, an opening large enough for a person appeared, and Eleanor saw their savior. For the first time, a tall man with a snow-crusted beard and determined eyes. "Madam," he said, extending a gloved hand toward her, "let me help you out first." Eleanor took his hand, allowing him to pull her through the snow tunnel he'd created. The biting cold of the outside air was shocking after the confined space of the overturned coach, but the man quickly wrapped a heavy buffalo hide around her shoulders. "Name's Henry Vance," he said, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Got a cabin not far from here. Saw your coach go over from up the ridge. Been digging since." One by one, he helped the survivors from the wreckage. The young couple emerged, supporting each other, and it took both Henry and the husband to carefully extract the injured salesman. The banker's body would have to wait until the storm passed. "Can't believe you found us in this," Eleanor said, her teeth chattering violently as Henry led them through the deep snow, a lantern held high to guide their way. "Weren't looking for you specifically, madam," Henry replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Was heading back from town when I spotted your coach. No one deserves to die frozen in a box if I can help it." The trek to Henry's cabin was brutal. The wind cut through Eleanor's clothes like knives, and several times she stumbled, only to be caught by Henry's strong hand. When the cabin finally came into view, a solid structure of logs with smoke curling from the chimney, It seemed like a mirage. Inside, warmth enveloped them like a blessing. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and rustic but sturdy furniture filled the main room. Henry moved with efficient urgency, stoking the fire higher, pulling blankets from a trunk and setting water to boil. "You folks need to get warm," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Then we'll see to injuries." Eleanor sank onto a wooden chair, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The young couple who introduced themselves as Joseph and Mary Winters huddled together near the fire. The salesman, Edward Porter, needed the most attention with his broken arm, which Henry splinted with surprising skill. "You've done this before," Eleanor observed as she watched him work. "5 years as a cavalry scout teaches a man a few things," Henry replied without looking up, "including how to mend what's broken in the field." Once everyone was settled with hot tea laced with whiskey, Eleanor finally had a chance to truly look at their rescuer. Henry Vance was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His dark hair was flecked with silver at the temples, and his beard, now thawed, was neatly trimmed. There was something in his steady gaze that calmed the residual panic in her chest. "We owe you our lives, Mr. Vance," she said softly. Henry shook his head. "Just did what any decent man would do." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, "but I suspect there aren't many men who would dig through snow until dawn to save strangers." For the first time, a small smile crossed Henry's face. "Dawn's still a ways off, madam. Been digging for hours, but the night's young yet." Eleanor realized he was right. Though it felt as if days had passed since the accident, it was only approaching midnight. The blizzard continued to rage outside, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked. "Hard to say," Henry replied, moving to add wood to the fire. "Could be done by morning. Could last 3 days. We're well stocked here, though. No need to worry." Eleanor nodded, though worry was becoming her constant companion. She had been traveling to Silver Creek to take up a position as the town's school teacher. A fresh start after the death of her parents had left her with few prospects in Denver. Now, stranded in a blizzard with strangers, her carefully laid plans seemed increasingly fragile. As if reading her thoughts, Henry asked, "What brings you folks out in weather like this?" Each of them shared their stories. The Winters were newly married and heading to Joseph's brother's ranch. Edward was a traveling salesman of patent medicines, and Eleanor explained about her teaching position. "Silver Creek, eh?" Henry nodded. "Small place, but decent folk. They've been wanting a proper school for years." "You know it?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "I supply them with meat through the winter months," Henry explained. "Do some trapping, hunting, trade with the town when weather permits." Eleanor studied him with new interest. "You live out here alone?" A shadow passed over Henry's face. "Got my horses and my dog, Thunder. He's out in the lean-to stable. Best companions a man could ask for." There was a story there, Eleanor sensed, but it wasn't her place to pry. Instead, she sipped her tea and listened as the conversation flowed around her. Despite the circumstances, there was something comforting about the cabin, with its solid walls and the steady presence of the man who had saved them. As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook them one by one. Henry arranged sleeping spaces, the Winters on his bed, Edward on a pallet near the fire, and Eleanor on the small cot in the corner that Henry explained had once belonged to his partner, a fellow trapper who had moved on to California years ago. "And where will you sleep?" Eleanor asked, concerned about displacing him. Henry nodded toward a bearskin rug near the fireplace. "I've slept on worse, madam. Don't you worry about me." Eleanor wanted to protest, but the events of the day had drained her completely. The moment her head touched the pillow, sleep claimed her, deep and dreamless. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in her body. The cabin was quiet. Mary Winters was still asleep on the bed, but the men were nowhere to be seen. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, Eleanor moved to the window and brushed aside the frost that coated the glass. Outside, the world had been transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched white. The sun sparkled off the snow, almost blindingly bright. And there, moving through this winter wonderland, was Henry, accompanied by a large black dog, carrying an armload of firewood. Eleanor watched him for a moment, struck by the picture he made against the snow, strong, capable, at home in this harsh environment. When he looked up and caught her watching, she felt a sudden warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Henry nodded at her through the window, a small smile on his lips before continuing toward the cabin. Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. She quickly smoothed her hair and straightened her rumpled clothes as best she could before he entered. "Morning," Henry said as he came through the door, his arms laden with wood. The dog, Thunder, she presumed, followed at his heels, a massive beast with intelligent eyes that immediately fixed on Eleanor. "Good morning," she replied, offering a tentative hand to the dog, who sniffed it thoroughly before giving it a gentle lick of approval. "I see the storm has passed." "For now," Henry confirmed, stacking the wood neatly beside the fireplace. "But the pass will be blocked for days. Snow's deep enough to swallow a man whole in some drifts." Eleanor's heart sank. "So we're stranded." Henry straightened, brushing snow from his coat before hanging it on a peg near the door. "Afraid so, madam, but you're welcome here until the way clears." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened again, and Joseph Winters entered, followed by Edward Porter, whose arm was in a sling fashioned from one of Henry's shirts. "Mr. Vance has been showing us his traps," Joseph explained, his face flushed with cold. "Man knows this mountain like the back of his hand." "Got enough meat to see us through," Henry added, moving to stir something in a pot hanging over the fire. "And your stagecoach driver's alive," Eleanor gasped. "Alive? Where is he?" "In the stable," Henry said. "Found him half buried in snow when I went to check on the coach this morning. Unconscious, but breathing. Got a nasty gash on his head, but he's tough. Should pull through." Relief flooded Eleanor. She had assumed the driver had perished in the accident. "When can we retrieve Mr. Blackwell's body?" she asked, thinking of the banker who hadn't survived. "Soon as the snow settles a bit more," Henry promised. "Not safe yet." The day passed in a strange domestic rhythm. Mary awoke and helped Eleanor prepare a simple breakfast from Henry's supplies. The men tended to the injured driver, who regained consciousness briefly before slipping back into a fitful sleep. Henry insisted they conserve lamp oil, so they relied on firelight and the bright reflection of sun on snow through the windows. Eleanor found herself watching Henry throughout the day. There was something fascinating about the quiet efficiency with which he moved, the gentle way he tended to the injured, the respectful manner in which he spoke to everyone. He was unlike any man she had met in Denver. As evening approached, Henry announced he would check his nearest trap lines. "I'll come with you," Eleanor said impulsively, eager for fresh air and a chance to stretch her legs after being confined. Henry looked surprised. "It's cold out there, madam, and the walking's difficult." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Vance," Eleanor replied with a smile, "and I'd welcome the exercise." After a moment's hesitation, Henry nodded. "Dress warm. We won't go far." Eleanor bundled up in layers, borrowing a pair of Henry's woolen socks to pull over her own. Outside, the cold air was shocking but refreshing after the close confines of the cabin. Thunder bounded ahead of them, occasionally disappearing into snowdrifts, only to emerge with a showering of white flakes. "He seems to enjoy the snow," Eleanor observed as they trudged along a path Henry had broken earlier. "Thunder was born in winter," Henry explained. "Never known him to be happier than when there's snow up to his belly." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their boots in the snow and Thunder's occasional excited bark. Eleanor found herself studying Henry's profile against the fading light, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the straight nose, the eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "May I ask you something, Mr. Vance?" she said at last. "Henry, please," he replied. "And yes, you may. Why do you live out here alone, so far from everything?" Henry was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear in the still air. After the war, I couldn't abide crowds, noise, people pressing in from all sides. He gestured to the vast expanse around them. Out here, a man can hear himself think, can live by his own hand, his own rules. The war, Eleanor echoed. You fought for the Union. Henry nodded. 4 years. Saw things no man should see. He paused, then added, lost people I cared about. Eleanor understood loss all too well. My father died in that war, she said quietly. My mother never really recovered. She passed last spring. Henry stopped walking, turning to look at her fully. I'm sorry for your losses, Miss Hayes. Eleanor, she corrected gently. And thank you. I've been trying to find my place since then. Teaching seemed like a way to do something meaningful. Henry resumed walking, but at a slower pace. Silver Creek needs someone like you. Those children have had precious little proper schooling. And what about you? Eleanor asked. Don't you ever get lonely out here? A faint smile touched Henry's lips. Sometimes. But loneliness is preferable to the alternative. Which is remembering too much. They reached the first trap line as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Henry checked the traps efficiently, finding 2 with rabbits, which he quickly and humanely dispatched before resetting the traps. Fresh meat for tomorrow, he said, securing the rabbits to his belt. We should head back before dark. The return journey seemed shorter, though Eleanor's legs ached from walking through the deep snow. By the time the cabin came into view, she was breathing hard, and her toes were numb despite the extra socks. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a welcome relief. Mary had prepared a simple stew from Henry's supplies, and the injured driver, Silas Jenkins by name, was awake and coherent enough to take some broth. The evening passed pleasantly, with Joseph revealing a talent for storytelling that kept them entertained. As Eleanor prepared for sleep that night, she found herself thinking about Henry, his quiet strength, his kindness, the sadness that lingered behind his eyes. There was something compelling about him that went beyond gratitude for their rescue. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. The snow began to melt slowly under the winter sun, but the pass remained impassable. Henry ventured out daily to check his traps and assess the road conditions, sometimes accompanied by Joseph or Edward, occasionally by Eleanor. The small cabin should have felt crowded with 6 people, but somehow they managed, each finding their own space and tasks. Eleanor found herself drawn to Henry's small bookshelf, surprised by the eclectic collection classics like Shakespeare and Homer, alongside practical guides to wilderness survival and a few dog-eared novels. You're a reader, she remarked one afternoon as she ran her fingers along the spines. Henry looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle at the table. Books are good company on long winter nights. May I? She asked, indicating a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Help yourself to any of them, Henry replied, though that one's a particular favorite. Eleanor settled into a chair by the window, opening the book carefully. Inside the cover she found an inscription, To Henry, who understands the wild places of the world and the soul, your friend always, Thomas. She looked up to find Henry watching her, something unreadable in his expression. A gift? She asked. From my brother, Henry said softly. Before Gettysburg. Understanding dawned. He didn't come home. Henry shook his head, returning his attention to the rifle. No, he didn't. Eleanor wanted to offer comfort, but sensed that sympathy wasn't what Henry needed. Instead, she began to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet cabin. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Henry's hands stilled on the rifle. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, there was a warmth there that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. Thomas used to read that to me, Henry said. Said Whitman understood what it meant to be truly alive in the world. Eleanor continued reading, feeling a connection to this quiet man growing with every verse. By the time she closed the book, the light had faded, and Mary was lighting the lamps for evening. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional crack of the fire, and the distant howl of a wolf. Her thoughts were filled with Henry, his gentle hands, his thoughtful words, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he almost smiled. It was foolish, she knew, to develop feelings for a man she had known for only days. Yet there was something about him that called to her, as if they had known each other in some previous life. On the morning of the fourth day, Henry announced that the pass was beginning to clear. "Another day or two, and it should be safe enough to travel," he told them over breakfast. "I'll take you as far as Silver Creek myself. Make sure you get there safely." Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She was eager to begin her teaching position, yet the thought of leaving the cabin and Henry filled her with an unexpected sadness. After breakfast, Henry and Joseph went to recover Mr. Blackwell's body from the stagecoach, wrapping it carefully for transport. Silas was well enough to sit up and take solid food, though his head injury would prevent him from driving for some time. That afternoon, while Mary napped and the men discussed the logistics of their journey to Silver Creek, Eleanor found herself alone with Henry on the small porch of the cabin. The air was cold but still, the world around them hushed under its blanket of snow. "Will you come into town sometimes?" Eleanor asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Once I'm settled in Silver Creek?" Henry leaned against the porch railing, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I make the trip every few weeks for supplies and to trade furs." "Then perhaps I'll see you there," Eleanor said, trying to keep her tone light. "I would like to properly thank you for saving our lives. Once we're not imposing on your hospitality." Henry turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You're not imposing, Eleanor. It's been—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Pleasant having company." Eleanor smiled, warmed by his use of her first name. Even when that company arrived half-frozen in an overturned stagecoach? A genuine smile broke across Henry's face, transforming his features. "Especially then. Makes for an interesting introduction." They both laughed, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of possibilities. "I've enjoyed our conversations," she admitted, "and your books. It's rare to find someone who appreciates Whitman out here." "The frontier attracts all types," Henry replied. "Some running from something, others running toward it. And some just looking for a place where they can breathe freely." "And which are you?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Henry was quiet for a moment. "Started as the first, hoping to become the third." Before Eleanor could respond, thunder barked sharply, alerting them to movement at the edge of the clearing. A moment later, a rider appeared, followed by a second. Henry straightened, one hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Expecting visitors?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uneasy. "No," Henry replied tersely. "Get inside, please." Eleanor hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone, but the seriousness in his eyes convinced her. She slipped inside the cabin, immediately alerting the others. Through the window, she watched as Henry stepped off the porch to meet the riders. There was tension in his stance that hadn't been there moments before. The riders dismounted, and one of them gestured animatedly, pointing toward the mountains. After what seemed like an eternity, Henry nodded and turned back toward the cabin. The riders remained where they were, waiting. When Henry entered, his expression was grim. "There's trouble," he announced. "A group of travelers is stranded about 5 miles north, their wagon broken down in the last stretch of bad drifts. These men were part of their party, sent ahead to find help." "How many?" Joseph asked, already reaching for his coat. 7, Henry replied, "including 2 women and a child. They're running low on food and firewood. We need to bring them here until the pass clears completely." There was no question of refusing. Despite the cabin's already crowded conditions, preparations began immediately. Mary and Eleanor reorganized the sleeping arrangements to accommodate more people. Joseph and Edward helped Henry gather additional firewood and bring in more supplies from the small storage shed behind the cabin. The Riders brothers named Nathan and Lucas Reed were given hot coffee while they waited. They explained that their party had been traveling from Wyoming to Denver when the storm had caught them. Their wagon had suffered a broken axle, and they had been forced to make a temporary camp while the two strongest men went for help. "We're fortunate you found us," Eleanor told them as she refilled their cups. "Mr. Vance knows these mountains better than anyone." "We saw smoke from the chimney," Nathan explained. "Hoped it meant civilization rather than Indians." Eleanor bristled slightly at his tone. "The local tribes are peaceful," she said, repeating what Henry had told her during one of their conversations. "Many trade regularly with Silver Creek." Nathan looked skeptical but didn't argue the point. Within an hour, Henry, Joseph, and Edward were prepared to depart, taking Thunder and the two horses that had pulled the stagecoach, but had survived the accident. They loaded supplies and extra blankets, planning to help the stranded travelers either repair their wagon or transport them to the cabin. As they were about to leave, Eleanor stepped forward, impulsively taking Henry's hand. "Be careful," she said softly. "The snow is still treacherous in places." Henry's fingers tightened briefly around hers. "We'll be back before nightfall," he promised. "Keep the fire going." Eleanor watched them disappear into the trees, a strange sense of foreboding settling over her. She dismissed it as nerves after all. Henry was more than capable in these mountains, but the feeling lingered as she returned to the cabin. The afternoon passed slowly. Eleanor kept herself busy, helping Mary prepare food for the incoming guests and tending to Silas, whose strength was returning gradually. The Reed brothers rested, exhausted from their journey. As the sun began to set with no sign of the rescue party, Eleanor's anxiety grew. She found herself repeatedly checking the window, straining to see through the gathering darkness. "They should have been back by now," she murmured, more to herself than to Mary, who was kneading dough for extra bread. "The snow slows everything down," Mary replied reassuringly. "And if the wagon needed repairs, that would take time." Eleanor nodded, though the unease remained. When the first howl echoed across the mountains, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Wolves," Nathan Reed said, sitting up from where he'd been dozing. "They get bold in winter when game is scarce." Another hour passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor was about to suggest they light a lantern outside as a beacon, when Thunder's distinctive bark broke the silence. Rushing to the door, she flung it open to see the rescue party emerging from the trees, not just Henry, Joseph, and Edward, but the additional travelers as well. Relief flooded through her as she counted the figures, all accounted for, plus the promised 7 strangers. As they drew closer, she could see that one of the women was being supported between 2 men, limping badly. Eleanor hurried forward to help, taking the woman's weight on one side. "Let's get you inside by the fire," she said gently. "Mary's prepared hot food for everyone." The newcomers were a bedraggled bunch, a middle-aged couple named Frank and Lillian Moore, their teenage son James, another couple named Daniel and Sarah Wilson, and an elderly man who introduced himself as Dr. George Harrington. The injured woman was Rachel Cooper, Daniel's sister, who had twisted her ankle badly in the snow. The cabin was crowded almost beyond capacity now, but no one complained. There was a shared sense of gratitude to be safe and warm. Henry organized sleeping arrangements with military precision, the injured and elderly nearest the fire. Families grouped together, single men in the lean-to stable with extra blankets. It wasn't until much later, when most had settled for the night, that Eleanor managed to speak with Henry alone. He was outside, checking on the horses one last time before retiring. "Thank you," she said simply, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the night air. Henry looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For being the kind of man who saves people," Eleanor replied. "First us, now them. It seems to be a habit with you." Henry secured the stable door before answering. "Just doing what needs doing. Nothing special about that." "I disagree," Eleanor said softly. "There's everything special about it." In the moonlight, she could see Henry's expression soften. He stepped closer, and for a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might touch her. Instead, he said, "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be busy." Eleanor nodded, disappointed yet understanding. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Eleanor." The next day brought clear skies and warmer temperatures that accelerated the melting of snow in the pass. Henry and several of the men rode out to assess the conditions and recovered the Moore's wagon, which they brought back to repair the cabin. With so many hands, the work went quickly. Dr. Harrington proved to be a skilled physician, properly setting Edward's arm and treating Rachel's ankle. The women worked together to prepare meals from the combined supplies, and even young James made himself useful by keeping the wood box filled. Eleanor found herself busier than ever, yet she also found moments to observe Henry in this new context. He led without demanding authority, offering suggestions rather than orders. He showed infinite patience with James's eager questions and made sure the elderly doctor was comfortable. And whenever his eyes met Eleanor's across the crowded room, there was a warmth there that made her heart flutter. By evening, the wagon was repaired, and Henry announced that the pass would likely be clear enough for travel by the following afternoon. "We'll all head out together," he said as they gathered for dinner. "Safety in numbers. I'll see everyone to Silver Creek, then those continuing to Denver can rest there before the final stretch." There was a general murmur of agreement and gratitude. The conversation turned to plans and preparations, but Eleanor found herself unable to join in. The thought of leaving the mountain and Henry left her feeling hollow. Later, as the cabin quieted for the night, Eleanor slipped outside once more. The air was milder than it had been, a hint of the coming spring despite the snow that still blanketed the ground. She walked to the edge of the clearing, gazing up at the stars that seemed close enough to touch. She didn't hear Henry approach until he spoke. "Couldn't sleep?" Eleanor turned, smiling despite the heaviness in her heart. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." Henry moved to stand beside her, his eyes on the night sky. "Silver Creek is a good town," he said after a moment. "You'll be happy there." "I hope so," Eleanor replied, "though I find myself reluctant to leave this mountain." Henry glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "The mountain will still be here, and so will I." Eleanor gathered her courage. "Will you visit? Not just for trading, but to see me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. Then, almost imperceptibly, Henry moved closer until their shoulders were nearly touching. "Would you want me to?" he asked, his voice low. "Very much," Eleanor whispered. Henry turned to face her fully. In the starlight, his eyes were luminous. "I'm not an easy man, Eleanor. The war left scars that don't show. I chose solitude because it was safer than letting anyone close enough to see the darkness." "I'm not afraid of darkness," Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek gently. "We all carry shadows." Henry covered her hand with his own, larger one. "Since you came tumbling into my life in that overturned stagecoach, I've felt something I thought was long dead." "And what's that?" Eleanor asked, barely breathing. "Hope," Henry said simply. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Eleanor answered it with her whole heart, rising on tiptoes to meet him more fully. Henry's arms encircled her, strong and sure, and in that moment, the cold night, the crowded cabin, the uncertain future, all faded away. When they finally parted, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come to Silver Creek," he promised, "as often as I can." "And I'll visit you here," Eleanor replied, "when school is not in session." Henry smiled, the expression transforming his face in the moonlight. "The town might talk." "Let them," Eleanor said with unexpected fierceness. "I've spent too long worrying what others think. Life is too precious for that now." They stood together under the stars for a long time, speaking of possibilities, of hopes, of the future. And when they finally returned to the crowded cabin, something had shifted between them, a connection forged in crisis and deepened in the quiet moments they had stolen together. The journey to Silver Creek the next day was slow but uneventful. The caravan of travelers, the stagecoach passengers, the stranded wagon party, and Henry leading the way made an impressive sight as they wound their way down the mountain pass. Thunder trotted alongside, occasionally racing ahead to scout the path. Eleanor rode with Henry at the front, their conversation flowing easily now that the barriers between them had begun to fall. He told her more about his life before the war, growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania with his brother Thomas. She shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's decision to move west for business opportunities, and her mother's reluctant adaptation to frontier life. By the time Silver Creek came into view, a small but tidy collection of buildings nestled in a valley, Eleanor felt as though she had known Henry for years rather than days. There was an ease between them that defied explanation, a sense of recognition that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. The town welcomed the travelers with typical frontier hospitality. The local hotel, though small, accommodated those continuing to Denver. Eleanor was shown to the rooms above the schoolhouse that would serve as her living quarters. They were simple but clean, with windows that looked out toward the mountains. Henry stayed only long enough to ensure everyone was settled. Standing at the door to Eleanor's new home, he seemed suddenly awkward, as if unsure of his place now that they had returned to civilization. "Will you be all right here?" he asked, his hat in his hands. Eleanor smiled, touching his arm gently. "I will, especially knowing you're not so far away." "I'll come back in 2 weeks," Henry said. "Need to bring furs for trading anyway." 2 weeks, Eleanor echoed. It seemed both too long and too short a time. Their goodbye was brief, a quick, almost shy kiss, a promise repeated. Then Henry was gone, riding back up the mountain with Thunder at his side, occasionally looking back until the town fell away behind him. Eleanor's position as Silver Creek's teacher began immediately. The town had 28 children of school age, ranging from 6 to 16, all eager for education. The work was challenging but rewarding, and Eleanor found herself quickly integrated into the small community. She made friends particularly with Sarah Wilson and her husband Daniel, who had decided to settle in Silver Creek rather than continue to Denver. Sarah's sister Rachel recovered from her ankle injury and found work at the local general store. The connections formed during their shared ordeal in the blizzard created a strong bond that made Eleanor's transition easier. Still, she counted the days until Henry's promised visit. When he finally appeared, leading 2 pack horses laden with furs, Eleanor had to restrain herself from running to meet him in front of the entire town. Instead, she waited until he had concluded his business at the trading post before approaching. "Mr. Vance," she said formally, aware of curious eyes. "How good to see you again." Henry's smile was small but genuine. "Miss Hayes, I trust you're settling in well." "Very well, thank you. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner this evening, to express my continued gratitude for your rescue." The twinkle in Henry's eye told her he understood the pretext. "I'd be honored, madam." That dinner was the first of many over the coming months. Henry's visits to Silver Creek became more frequent, and the town soon accepted his presence as a natural extension of Eleanor's life. They walked together, talked together, and gradually, their relationship deepened into something neither had expected to find. Summer came to the mountains, transforming the landscape into a riot of wildflowers and green meadows. On one of Henry's visits, he brought Eleanor up to his cabin for the day, showing her the beauty of his mountain in full bloom. "It's different without the snow," Eleanor remarked as they walked hand in hand along a stream that bubbled with snowmelt from the higher elevations. Thunder ranged ahead, occasionally returning to check on them before bounding off again. "Every season has its charms," Henry replied, "but summer has always been my favorite. Everything feels so alive." They stopped to rest on a sun-warmed rock beside the stream. Eleanor leaned against Henry's shoulder, content in a way she had never expected to be. "I've been thinking," Henry said suddenly, his voice serious. Eleanor looked up, curious. "About what?" "About us, about the future." He turned to face her fully. "These past months, coming to see you, leaving again, it's getting harder each time." Eleanor's heart quickened. For me as well. Henry took her hands in his. I know I'm not what most would consider a good match. I live in the wilderness, I have little money, and I carry more darkness than any man should. Henry, Eleanor began, but he shook his head. Let me finish. Despite all that, I find myself hoping for things I never thought I'd want again. A home that's more than shelter. A life that's more than survival. He paused, his eyes holding hers. I'm asking if you would consider marrying me, Eleanor. Not right away, I know you need time to think. To be sure, Eleanor silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her certainty, all her love into the gesture. When they parted, she was smiling through tears. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you, Henry Vance. The surprise and joy that crossed Henry's face was a sight Eleanor knew she would treasure forever. He gathered her close, his embrace fierce yet gentle, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. I don't have a ring, he said when they finally pulled apart. Not yet, Eleanor shook her head. I don't need one. I just need you. They were married that autumn in Silver Creek's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, along with friends made during the blizzard ordeal. The Winters traveled from Joseph's brother's ranch. Edward Porter adjusted his sales route to attend, and even Silas Jenkins, fully recovered, came to witness the union. Eleanor wore a simple gown of deep blue, with wildflowers in her hair that Henry had gathered that morning. Henry had procured a proper suit for the occasion, looking so different from the mountain man who had dug them from the snow that Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the transformation. The reception was held at the schoolhouse, with tables groaning under the weight of potluck dishes contributed by the townsfolk. Dancing continued well into the evening, and when Henry finally led his bride away, there were cheers and good-natured teasing that followed them into the night. They had decided on a compromise for their living arrangements. Eleanor would continue teaching through the winter months, staying in town, while Henry would maintain his cabin for hunting and trapping. During the summer, when school was not in session, Eleanor would join him on the mountain. Additionally, they purchased a small piece of land on the outskirts of Silver Creek, where they planned to eventually build a permanent home together. Their first winter as husband and wife brought its own challenges and joys. Eleanor had never known such happiness, even as she worried whenever Henry was away on the mountain. But he always returned, sometimes with fresh game, sometimes with stories of Thunder's exploits, always with a love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. When spring arrived, Eleanor discovered she was expecting a child. The news was met with mixed emotions. Joy, certainly, but also concern about the practicalities of raising a family divided between town and mountain. Perhaps it's time to build our house, Henry suggested one evening as they sat on the porch of her schoolhouse quarters, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in gold and crimson. Eleanor rested her hand on her still flat stomach. I'd like that. A place that's truly ours. The construction began immediately, with Henry leading the effort. The town rallied around them, providing labor and materials in the frontier tradition of barn raising. By midsummer, the small but sturdy house was completed 2 bedrooms, a cozy parlor, a kitchen with a large cast-iron stove, and wide porches front and back to catch the mountain breezes. Their son, Thomas, named for Henry's brother, was born in September of 1880, a robust baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression. Henry was transformed by fatherhood. His natural protectiveness now extended to this tiny being who had so utterly captured his heart. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed to Eleanor one night as they stood over Thomas's cradle, watching their son sleep. A family. A future worth fighting for. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart. You saved us from that blizzard, she said softly. But in many ways, I think we saved each other. Henry's arms tightened around her. Every day since I pulled you from that stagecoach has been a gift I never expected. The years that followed brought more children, a daughter, Laura, born in 1882, and another son, William, in 1884. The cabin on the mountain became a summer retreat for the family, a place where the children learned to fish and identify animal tracks under their father's patient guidance. Henry still hunted and trapped, but he also developed a reputation as a guide for wealthy Easterners who came west for hunting expeditions. The work was lucrative and allowed him to be home more often with his growing family. Eleanor continued teaching until William's birth, after which she focused on raising their children. She started a small lending library in their home, which eventually grew into a proper town library housed in its own building. Her influence on Silver Creek's educational development was profound and lasting. There were difficulties, of course. The winter of 1883 brought another devastating blizzard that reminded them all too vividly of their first meeting. There were illnesses, accidents, the normal trials of frontier life. But through it all, Henry and Eleanor's bond remained unshakable, a love forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Henry had dug through snow until dawn to rescue the overturned stagecoach. They returned to his original cabin on the mountain. The children stayed with friends in town, giving them a rare night alone together. The cabin was much as it had been, though Henry had made improvements over the years. Thunder, now elderly but still loyal, dozed by the fireplace, occasionally thumping his tail when one of them spoke. "It's strange to think how different our lives might have been if you hadn't seen our stagecoach go over," Eleanor mused as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Henry took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," he said. "Some things are meant to be." Eleanor smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Says the man who once told me he didn't believe in fate." "You changed my mind about many things, Eleanor Vance," Henry replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That's just one of them." Below them, Silver Creek's lights twinkled in the valley, a constellation of human endeavor against the wilderness. Their own house was among those lights, the home they had built together, filled with books and laughter and the occasional argument, a testament to the life they had created from an unexpected beginning. "I love you," Eleanor said simply, the words no less powerful for having been said countless times before. Henry's response was equally simple, equally profound. "And I love you, more than I have words to express." As they sat together under the vast Colorado sky, Eleanor thought of all the twists and turns that had led them to this moment: a stagecoach overturned in a blizzard, a determined man digging through snow until dawn, a connection formed in crisis and deepened through choice, day after day, year after year. Some might call it chance, others destiny. Eleanor preferred to think of it as the most fortunate accident of her life, one that had given her not just survival, but the truest love she could have imagined. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and eventually had families of their own, as Silver Creek prospered and expanded, as the wilderness gradually gave way to civilization, Henry and Eleanor Vance remained a constant, a love story told and retold throughout the county, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the human heart's capacity for connection could overcome any obstacle, just as surely as a determined man could dig through snow until dawn to save strangers who would become his family.